Okay, thank you so much, Gideon. I think we're good to go.
Great, thanks. So, Anabaptism's place in modern Africa. So, most of the information that I'm going to talk about today, and most of the things I'll be presenting in this presentation, is mostly to do with the master's paper that I wrote, and most of the work that I had done during my time doing my master's at the center. And so, I was mainly concerned with the core principles of Anabaptism and actually what made the movement what it is in relation to how those principles can actually play themselves out in the modern African and contemporary landscape of Africa. And to begin off with, I'd like to open with a quote from quite an important book that was written by Lapp and Snyder called Anabaptist Songs in African Hearts. And the quote says that the Mennonite World Conference in 1994 reported that for the first time in Mennonite and Brethren in Christ history, more baptized members lived in Africa, Asia, and Latin America than in Europe and North America. And this it wasn't just a simple statistical observation when I came across it, but it was more a revelation of where the tides of global Christianity is actually moving and where it is going to, and that most of the global South becomes the central place where the Christian story is playing itself out in a very fervent and very much so vital and lively manner. And one particular area within this is the continent of Africa, which has become more of a central focus for what is happening religiously, not only in the Christian sense, but in global religious movements as a whole. That there's a growth of Christianity, but there's also a growth of Islam. We used to think of Islam as before. We used to think of Islam as just having an influence on the continent of Africa within the northern regions, just above the Maghreb in terms of your Morocco, your Tunisias, and the Egypts. But now that influence has been pushing its way downwards towards sub-Saharan Africa, where many societies and populations are identifying themselves as being followers of the Islamic religion, mostly in East and West Africa. And so Africa finds itself in this very interesting place within the 21st century where religion and the idea of belief is promulgated and is growing and is having this reaching the zenith of religious fervor and belief. And so the key question that I wanted to ask today, a key question that I was also dealing with in much of my studies was what is or what can Anabaptism's place in contemporary Africa be? And the way to answer this, or the way to approach such a question, if there is even an answer, but the way to approach such a question is to actually map out where the continent is and map out where exactly the continent in its global and geopolitical landscape finds itself in, because then the biggest story of where Africa is within the modern world paints a better picture for where Anabaptism can be within the intimate spaces of African society and cultures, because then you can see where effect can really be, where the change and the effect can really begin to happen, as opposed to many of the previous epochs that have had missionary work coming in, either from the Protestant side or from the Catholic side, or from any other stream, coming in with almost an idea of misunderstanding the geographical context of the African continent, and misunderstanding even how the socio-political systems of this continent have been mapped out, which is a very huge landscape filled with many different cultures and perspectives on life. And so, with the sensitivity that Anabaptism has, especially with its history within the 16th century, being a movement in the fringes, I think there's almost a sweet spot in which Anabaptism has the potential to do something that is far more different compared to the other major theological movements such as Protestantism or Catholicism. And so moving on from this, that touching on the history of the Reformation, for the Anabaptists, the history of the Reformation was kind of like the inception of the movement. Was this the beginning, the grassroots project and idea of uh, of this movement that was growing out of places like Zwingli's teachings and out of Luther's protests against the the church at the time, the Standard Church. And so the Reformation paints out this picture of the beginnings of this movement. But when the Reformation is read from a world stage, the Reformation also paints out a key social historical epoch for parts of the world, particularly Africa, where the Reformation promulgates this idea of moving outside of Europe and finding other greener pastures, possibly escaping the persecution that is rampant in Europe by finding other places where religious tolerance can be more acceptable. And so the Reformation paints this picture where the world in and of itself, the European world is being transformed and changed by these social, political, and historical processes. But in the same time, the world of Europe that is changing is also having an effect on the global world as it is. And so the Reformation has this double-edged, this binary aspect to it, where there is something happening inland Europe within the central spaces of what is happening within Germany, within Switzerland, and all those key central areas where Anabaptism is really taking a growth and an aspect in towards its movement and growth, but also again the aspects of how that affects the global world where most Anabaptists would actually move to, such as the North Americas and such places, becomes a key aspect of the after effects, the ripple effects of what this Reformation movement actually is doing. And so, to touch on another aspect is the history of missions in Africa as well, and how a continent such as Africa came to be shaped. And the history of missions in Africa becomes a key and important factor in terms of how Anabaptism finds itself in this quagmire of belief, in this back and forth of ideas and movements that are happening within such a large landscape. And so the history of missions, whether it's through Catholicism, which really began within the same period of the Reformation, or just a bit after that, when it was the Protestants who were actually doing most of the work after them, the history of missions has been a very, a very, a very, you can say, good and bad outcome of what had happened in that time concerning the Christian faith. And the Christian, the missionary history of Africa's growth into the Christian faith had come through the means of the sword as well. And there was a Bible on the one hand, and the sword of the imperial regime at that time as well. And so there is this aspect in which Africa finds itself torn between the two when it comes to the history of missions and the faith aspect of of Christianity's of Christianity's growth within the continent. And all of this spans about 400 to 500 years, in the same light that we now sit here and we are celebrating the 500 years of Anabaptism's history, there's also a a a a a, a an opposite side to it, a different history, an underside to the history that peoples of the global south have experienced in that sense. And so these are the realities in which I believe that Anabaptism's place in Africa needs to be conscious of, that very sensitive history that introduced Africa into the modern world. And with that history in mind, there also has to be a further survey, a mapping out of the landscape of what modern Africa is going through in terms of its religious explosion today, which, for better or worse, did come from that history of colonialism, that history of missionary work, that history of exploration, and all of those things included into it. And so the African continent has now become the center of a religious development, and not just religious development, but the development of many multifaceted ideas that have influenced its makeup and its shape today. So we have Protestantism, as I spoke earlier, and Catholicism having a long stretched history, stretching back centuries into the past, of how it has shaped and it has coincided with the growth of the identity and idea of what Africa and African societies are. And added to that, you have a very interesting growth and explosion of Pentecostalism and charismatic movements happening within the 20th century, from the early 1900s all the way through to the 2000s. You see this growth of Pentecostalism, mainly influenced from the American movements and churches that grew in this very Pentecostal fervor that had a big influence on Africa's growth and Africa's time as the boom of this boom or revival of Christian growth. Maybe some here will remember the times of Reinhard Bonnke and all of that. Doing missionary work or evangelizing to thousands, if not millions, of Africans out in the plateaus of Nigeria and all those interesting places that he did that. And so the growth of Pentecostalism and charismatic movements becomes a key factor in the aspect of how Anabaptism navigates itself within these very fervent and very explosive forms of belief and attaining their relationship, a sense of relationality to God. And another important factor, as I've spoken before, is Islam's prominence as an alternative to Christianity. As I said, that it was the idea of Africa's Islamic influence was mainly limited to the northern regions, which, given the Sahara Desert, had a closer affinity to how Arabia and most of the Middle East would look like. And so there was that closer affinity even within the minds of African Arabs, and even the stretching back within the Iberian Peninsula in that history of Portugal, Spain being close to Morocco. The idea was that the northern part of Africa wasn't necessarily Africa itself, but it was almost a piece of Arabia. And so you see the growth and the influence of Islam having a deep-rooted history within the African continent, where it's not just a sense of like it's not just a visiting religion. It's not just a religion that ended up just stumbling into parts of Africa, but it is a religion in as much sense as Christianity has become part and parcel of the African identity, that Islam has also become part and parcel of that identity. And now what we see within the 20th century and moving on into the 21st is this downward movement of Islam into parts of West Africa, East Africa, and even further down south into Central and possibly even Southern Africa as well. And so Islam's prominence is another key factor in which Anabaptism's place in Africa will have to deal with and will have to contend with in terms of how it actually begin a form of praxis, having all these other faith expressions or religious expressions being held fervently at a time of Africa's religious growth and revival. And so there's also another key factor to this, although it's quite limited in spaces because there isn't so much a practice of this, but the idea of returning to African indigenous spirituality also is growing to be a more of an important factor for the African climate and the African landscape, just because of how history has played itself out. There's almost a feeling of a loss of identity amongst many Africans who feel like by adopting Christianity, by adopting Islam, by adopting many of these other forms of religions, they are almost losing a sense of. Sorry, can you hear me? Am I okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll keep going. There's almost the sense of losing their historical heritage and identity when it comes to that aspect of their history. And so Africa, in a sense, is having all these ideas thrown at it, and it is really a a just a boiling pot of all of these movements, these faith-based movements, religious movements. And as I wrote my paper, my master's paper, I came across an idea or a word that I felt like I needed to capture the feeling and the sense of this. And that idea that I came across was this idea of theological locomotion, and which I had a feeling or a sense of defining it as a chaotic sense of movement, a back and forth, an up and down, a period buzzing with the vitality of belief, a coming and this vitality of belief comes from all sorts of directions. It is almost like just a confusing mess of ideas and thoughts and mainly religious and theological practices that are coming from nowhere and are coming from everywhere, all at the same time in this bubbling pot of what modern African expression is. And where the continent of Africa actually becomes quite an interesting and unique space to do such work as Anabaptist work in Africa is that Africa, in a sense, or African societies have been one of those societies which have been quite comfortable to hold in contradiction many ideas as they appear or manifest themselves to them. Now, given the history of how Africa has dealt with these ideas, where there were seasons and epochs of retaliating against these ideas, but there were also seasons and epochs of seeing how valuable and useful these ideas have been. This fervent spirit of opening themselves up or opening up the continent and its societies to new and growing ideas has been a very interesting aspect for me personally as an African, seeing how the continent and the society has been not overtly in opposition to any of these ideas, but welcoming them in a sense of like to improve how their societies function and are run. And so the theological locomotion and the chaos is not something that is rejected by modern Africa, but it's something that is actually celebrated by modern Africa. It is a sense in which there's a God that still cares about these societies. There's a God that is still very much involved, that is very much involved in the everyday and in the intimate sense of how life is run. And there isn't almost a cessation from that which is higher, that which is divine. There's an intimate sense in which these ideas are held to, and there isn't a sense to rush off into secularizing all aspects of life, which I find very interesting and something that I feel like Africa, not only Anabaptism can offer the African continent, but Africa can offer the global world itself, and particularly probably um, Western secularism too. And so Anabaptism in Africa finds itself amid this religious climate of theological locomotion, as I said before, and the work of Anabaptism becomes even more important and very pressing and timely, because again, as I was trying to develop in my paper in my master's, was that um, the whole Christian world has to begin to pay attention to how religion is playing itself within the African continent, because that is where the future of Christianity, amongst other religions, of course, but that is where particularly the future of Christianity will play itself in the most overt sense. And so there is an importance in which Anabaptists all over the world will have to pay attention to this particular region and what is actually happening there. And so, three things I just wanted to mention here, which are the three things that I believe Anabaptism can do well to to actually engage or provide this space of theological locomotion. And those three things are tolerance and the idea of coexistence and the freedom of religious expression. And these ideas, given maybe the history of Protestantism or the history of Catholicism, these ideas wouldn't be as welcomed because they do give a sense of opening up oneself to the possibilities of the other. And the other might not worship, might not do church praxis as you do, might not even hold to the same idea of God as you would. But yet, the idea of tolerance, the idea of being able to coexist with other humans, even though they hold to different sets of histories, theologies, and religions, I think becomes a really key and important aspect, especially in a continent where now the forms of Islamic extremism is on the growth, and the idea of what I believe in is right, and the possibility of using violence to justify that is on the rise, and it becomes a sensitive issue when it comes to this sense of intolerance that can grow out of faith aspects, even within Christianity itself. And so there is a space in which Anabaptism can really have a big effect, and it really have a voice that speaks in a very practical sense, because there's a history that backs Anabaptism's sense of tolerance, a sense of coexistence, and sense of religious expression as well. The history in itself is evident in the inception of the movement itself. The idea that Anabaptism being caught in the middle of these two major colossal religious movements, be it Luther's Protestantism or the Vatican's Catholicism, and being caught in the middle there, being very fragile, very vulnerable, uh, has an appeal to how modern Africa is playing itself. And it will become really the job of those churches those churches in the Congo, those churches in Ethiopia, those churches in Zimbabwe, and many other parts. Those Brethren in Christ churches, Anabaptist churches, Mennonite associated networks. These topics and these discussions of tolerance and coexistence will really become key in terms of how religion and the idea of belief begins to play itself within 21st century Africa. And so the African context could loosely resemble the religious context of the early Anabaptists. And again, as I said before, this begs the question of practicality, especially from the Anabaptist perspective in Africa. The question being that how then do we begin to fit ourselves? How then do we begin to leave a mark? How then do we begin to navigate through this quagmire of religious belief and fervor? And so African Anabaptism gets to the matters of the principles, given that it treats the tradition differently. And the Anabaptist tradition, in a sense, is seen in a different light when it comes to African adherents of Anabaptism. The thing that I discovered from just interacting with African Anabaptists themselves, whether back in South Africa or just through correspondences while I'm here in Dublin, is that the thing that ties them to the Anabaptist faith itself is the core principles, those core ideas that drove the initial Anabaptists into this faith aspect in the first place. It is not necessarily the debate on the tradition. It is not necessarily the historical progression and all of that. Maybe something that might fascinate more Western followers or adherents of Anabaptism. But what matters really are those key principles, because there's something that is something that they can relate to concerning the period of the 1500s and how things were playing out there in comparison to modern Africa today. And so African Anabaptism will need to determine what matters, given the history of the movement and also its place in the world. And that is my presentation. I didn't want to go over time, but those were just the key things that I just wanted to point out in this presentation over here. So thank you so much for listening to me.